All right, here we are in lesson 7.3, percents and decimals. We've been working with fractions to solve percent problems. We are now going to switch into using decimals to solve percent problems. Hopefully you realize that fractions and decimals are equivalent to each other. So because you can solve percent problems using fractions, you can also solve percent problems using decimals. It looks different, we represent it differently, but it's the same idea. Short paragraph here about hippos, pygmy hippos. The African pygmy hippo is the smallest species of hippopotamus. Suppose a common adult hippo weighs 5,600 pounds and an adult pygmy hippo's weight is 10.5% or 10.5% of the common adult hippo's weight. How much does the adult pygmy hippo weigh? You will find the answer in example 4. So we'll come back to that one in a little while. Some things we know about decimals and fractions. Because 0.25 or 25 hundredths is equal to the fraction 25 hundredths, and the fraction 25 hundredths is equal to 25%, you can say that the decimal 25 hundredths is equivalent to 25%. We know that. We've known that for some time, but it's important to bring that back to the forefront of your mind as you look at this lesson. This relationship that we just looked at suggests the following rules for writing decimals as percents and percents as decimals. So here's our summary. To write a decimal as a percent, move the decimal point 2 places to the right and write a percent sign. To write a percent as a decimal, move the decimal point 2 places to the left and remove the percent sign. These are easy things to do. However, it's important to pay attention to why you're doing what you're doing and when it's appropriate to go to the left or to the right. So we'll try to point that out as we go here. So here I am in my note-taking guide now on the same lesson. Our goal is to use decimals to solve percent problems. And here's that summary we just looked at with some blanks, percents and decimals. To write a decimal as a percent, move the decimal point 2 places to the blank and blank. Now I could just copy this out of my book, but it probably would be more helpful to think, if I'm ever stuck on a problem, how will I remember this? Let's go back to that one we know so well. We know that the decimal 25 hundredths is equivalent to 25%. Let's look at what happens to the decimal point when we go from the decimal form to the percent form. If you look at this on the left here, 25 hundredths has a decimal point here. 25%, the 25 is a whole number, so the decimal point's on the right. So it looks like if you're going from a decimal to a percent, we're going to move the decimal point to the right twice and then add that percent sign. So to write a decimal as a percent, move the decimal point 2 places to the right, and write a percent sign. Don't just memorize, think about why that happened. So here now we're talking about the opposite. To write a percent as a decimal, move the decimal point 2 places to the blank and blank. Again, let's say I'm in the middle of a test or an assignment and I can't remember what I'm supposed to do. I'm going to start with a simple percent that I know. I know 25% is equivalent to the decimal 0.25 or 25 hundredths. Looking at the decimal point, 25% has a whole number in it. There's the decimal point. The decimal point in the decimal form is right there. So it looks like to go from the percent to the decimal, I have to move the decimal point to the left twice, so it lands here, and take out the percent sign. So to write a percent as a decimal, move the decimal point 2 places to the left and remove the percent sign. So there's our summary of what we're doing. Now let's look at a couple examples in our book. Example 1, we're going to write several decimals as percents. Take a look at what they're doing here in part A. I'll get another screen shade here. In part A, they're taking the decimal 62 hundredths, moving the decimal point twice to the right, and adding a percent sign. So 62 hundredths is 62%. This one's a little bit harder because we don't think about the number 1 having a decimal point. However, if we want to give it a decimal point, we can put it at the end of the number, moving the decimal point to the right twice. You can see you have to add 2 zeros, and the whole number 1 is equivalent to 100%. Here's another one that's not as simple as A. 2.3 or 2 3/10. Again, moving the decimal point to the right twice, you end up with 230%. Going in the opposite direction, writing percents as decimals. Again, they're giving us several percents, and they want us to write them as decimals. In part A, we're starting with 75%. In 75, the decimal point's on the right-hand side. We're going to move it to the left twice, drop the percent sign, and we have 75 hundredths. That one's simple. Here's a slightly more complicated one. This is less than 1%, 0.4%. So 0.4%, here's your decimal. They're moving it to the left twice, adding a 0, and ending up with 4 thousandths. And here again is one you probably wouldn't think about as much, 168%, something over 100%. The decimal in 168% would start out on the right, and we're moving it to the left twice, ending up with 1 68 hundredths, 1.68. Looking over here at the side note, these are often important to read. They can give you good insight into what you're trying to learn. Percents greater than 100% are written as numbers greater than 1. So there's an example over here. Here's in C, we have a percent that's greater than 100%. So the decimal is greater than 1. Going back to my study strategy, percents less than 1% are written as numbers less than 100th. We know 1% is equivalent to 100th. Here's an example here of a decimal that's less than 1%, 0.4%. So you'll notice the decimal ends up as less than 100th. And then finally, at the end of our study strategy, it says to write such percents as decimals, follow the same steps as you would for percents between 1% and 100%. So the steps aren't different. It just looks strange because we're not used to seeing percents that are less than 1% and greater than 100%. So here's example 1 in our note-taking guide. We're going to write several decimals as percents. They're giving us some hints here. They're moving the decimal point for us. So 17 hundredths, moving the decimal point to the right twice, gives us 17%. The whole number 2 can have a decimal point placed right after it. We can move the decimal point to the right twice, which gives us 200%. And the decimal 3 2/10, moving the decimal point to the right twice, gives us 320%. In example 2, going the other way, given a percent, writing it as a decimal, they're giving us some help here. 63%, here's the decimal point, moving it twice to the left, 63 hundredths. 0.7%, or 0.7%, moving the decimal point to the left twice, we end up with 7 thousandths. And finally, 129%. Decimal point would start out here in 129, move to the left twice. The decimal form of 129% is 1 29 hundredths. Here's some extra practice. If you don't need this, you can go ahead and work on your checkpoints in your note-taking guide. But in case you need some extra practice, let's work through a few more. 461. So I'm just going to think for a minute. If I'm doing an assignment and I've forgotten what to do, here's what I'm always going to think about. It looks like to go from a decimal to a percent, I'm moving my decimal point to the right. To go from a percent to a decimal, it looks like I'm going to move the decimal point to the left and drop the percent sign. So using that as a guide, here I would, for number 1, I would get, moving my decimal point to the right, that would be 46 1/10%. For number 2, the decimal point would be here in this decimal number, moving it to the right twice. I have 2 decimal places to fill in with zeros. It looks like I'm going to get 500%. 1 9/10, moving the decimal point to the right, I'm going to get 190%. And then for 7 thousandths here in number 4, moving the decimal point to the right, I'm going to get 7/10 of a percent, 0.7%. Thinking again about going from a percent to a decimal, I'm moving to the left. 27% is 27 hundredths. 184%, moving to the left, is equivalent to 1 84 hundredths. 3%, which is my decimal point, moving to the left twice, having to fill in a 0 there, I'm getting 3 hundredths. And finally, here's a percent less than 1%, 55 hundredths of a percent. Same steps. I'm going to move my decimal point to the left twice, giving me 0.0055 as my decimal. So that's the end of examples 1 and 2 and extra examples. At this point, you should be able to do your checkpoint questions in your note-taking guide.